And very good morning to all of you. I'm very delighted to be here today to present you the experience of some selected EU member states, but also the experience of the European Union. Before starting my presentation, I just would like to thank on behalf of the European Union, the governments of Philippines, and in particular GBM for hosting this event, but also Hofi and Kuyen for their leadership on the B Cup events. It's marked now the end of PEMNA 2, so it's also a coin of appreciation on my end, and of course a big thanks for the PEMNA secretariats to make this event happen with financial support from the governments of Korea and the European Union. So as I said, today I will be presenting you a few concrete examples from member states. It's a long past performance-based budgeting in the EU. So I will tell you a bit the story. But before starting the presentation itself with a focus on given countries, I just wanted to provide you the OECD definition of performance budgeting, which says basically it's a systematic use of information about output, result, and impact of public policies in order to inform, influence, and or determine the level of public funds allocated towards this policy in a budgetary context. So in the EVA presentation, you could see three approaches. In my presentation, I actually pointed four. These are the four ones. A presentational approach, I would kind of say it's the kind of performance information and output level that is attached as a background information during the budget, so there is no direct links. Informed budgeting is when really you start to put some performance metrics in the budgetary discussion, and that has an impact on the way you present budget documents and usually influences the budget allocation. Performance-based budgeting is really where there are clear expectations that the performance will lead to an increase of allocation. On this one, I would say it's probably where we strive for, or we try at least to go towards performance-based budgeting. But at this stage, I would say most of EU member states varies from presentational to performance-informed budgeting. The last one is maybe less linked to budget allocation, but it's very important, is the shift of organizational behavior with the managerial performance approach. The OECD has been reviewing the EU budget for results approach that I will be presenting you briefly at EU level. This was actually co-drafted by Delphine Moretti, who you met at the plenary in Laos last year. And basically the OECD review, when looking at the EU way of doing performance budgeting, assess basically the EU approach matching these four approaches. So why do we do performance budgeting? There are multiple reasons. First, I think it's clearly transparency towards parliamentarians, but our citizens as well, to justify how we spend taxpayers' money. Accountability for also the government's mandates to know and keep track that they're delivering on their strategic goals, but also at organizational level, like the Ministry of Finance, whether as an institution we are delivering our targets, but also within, as a manager, also whether I deliver what I'm supposed to. Austerity has actually been increasingly important after the financial crisis in 2008 in the EU has been very predominant to justify austerity measures and cuts. That was one of the main focus for performance budgeting. And of course, always looking for additional efficiency. We are often asked to do always more with less money. So it's the value for money from a personal point of view, but also allocative when you look at whether the resources have been allocated in the best effective way. And cultural shift, as I said, is not to be underestimated, as this can also have some resistance on the side of the administration, but there is an important shift towards results and delivery across EU member states and at the EU level. So focusing on the 6 EU member states that I wanted to present to you, I will start with France. France basically had what we call a big bang approach in 2001, where they amended their legislative apparatus up until the organic law of 2006, where really they put focus on performance budgeting. It entailed massive resources from 2001 to 2006, where each ministry had to set up a team focusing on performance budgeting. And in the National Assembly, there was also an evaluation committees of public policy focusing on statistics and all performance information available. The major areas of reforms that was led through the organic budget law of 2006 entails the simplification of the budget nomenclature to help identifying where basically the money is spent in the different areas. It includes as well a single framework that is reviewed annually and a drastic reductions on the number of objectives and indicators. France has been very keen in focusing on communication. So a lot of budget documentation has been also done with this in mind. And I've shared here the link to the State General Budget Result Report of the French government, which basically show you in a very concise and visual formats where money is being spent and what is it for. Another interesting part and the big effort that was done by the French government was on alignments between the strategic objectives and the goals set on each program. They have created a central IT systems where they basically register all performance indicators and where you can actually see the link from each performance indicator to the overall strategic goal. The budget, the French budget is basically divided into 31 missions, which each of them have different programs. If you look at the level of one program, you have a respective strategic framework, policies, and performance program. What is interesting is the performance indicators not only focus on the program performance, but also on the performance of the government institution, which basically push even a step forward toward the effectiveness of public spending. The state audit office is also very important because it's clearing the budget, and it does also the mandate of the state audit office in France has increased dramatically because every year they are actually targeted to review all ministries' performance indicators. One thing also, when I was talking earlier about the cultural shift, this was recognized by the Financial Committee of the French National Assembly and also reports of auditor that the shift towards performance budgeting was definitely now embedded into the French civil service culture. And this has been actually one of the major success after 2 decades of rolling out this reform. Now moving to Sweden. Sweden is probably our EU member state that had the longest experience with performance budgeting. It's over 3 decades. What is interesting, I think, in the case of Sweden is they have set up informal working groups between the Ministry of Finance and the National Assembly, where then they are sitting together and agreeing on a selected number of indicators for parliamentary debates when it's about approving the budget. And I think this also echoes very much on what Ivo was saying earlier in his presentation, when you need to select very few indicators depending on the targeted audience. And on this, even Sweden goes a step further in terms of long-term perspective. They require performance indicators to have a 10 years perspective, regardless of the shocks that can come in or all unforeseeable events taking place. Why? The main reason for the Swedish government is if you cannot have an indicator that is stable enough, you're at the risk of losing consistency in terms of your strategic goal over the medium to long term. Germany, it's an interesting case because they don't use performance indicator in the budgetary decision, but they have extensive use of spending reviews. So basically, the spending reviews really look at what are the aim of the expenditures and revenues targeted and focus a lot on effectiveness and efficiencies of spendings. Here, I just wanted to share with you the example of a recent spending review that was conducted at the federal level. So usually the Ministry of Finance of Germany is on the lead for the spending reviews, which happen on an annual basis, and selects at least 2 line ministries to work together. In this specific case, when it was about assessing the extent to which the Sustainable Development Goals are embedded into the German federal government budgets, they have been partnering with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Environment. So you have the link here if you want to have a bit more information on it. Netherlands is also another interesting case because they started performance budgeting in the early 2000s, where it was at a time of a coalition government, where basically each parties were pushing for their own reform agenda, and at least in terms of objectives to be reached. This has created obviously a proliferation of number of indicators and on monitoring objectives set and agreed among the coalition between. So after about a decade of this experience, they have made a stock taking exercise, and the findings were actually quite straightforward. The first is it was a real administrative burden for the administration to report on all this high number of indicators. The indicators were not actually defined for identifying quick savings, and they were basically collected in a very technocratic and mechanical ways without really being used by parliamentarians or by citizens. So that really pushed in 2011 and 2013 to budget reforms, focusing again on results, mainstreaming a lot the approach toward performance budgeting, and reducing by half actually the number of indicators. An interesting part also of this reform program, that's something that later we as the EU has been inspired from, is the Netherlands has introduced, in addition to the performance indicators, what they call a policy conclusion statements for each program, which basically tell the story of all these figures and beautiful graphs that we produce on a yearly basis, but just contextualize a bit further for parliamentary debates and engaging with citizens. The last two examples are very different on backgrounds on why they moved towards performance-based budgeting, but the way they have moved on that path is pretty similar. So the case of Ireland is the strong push, I would say, was a debt crisis that's basically led to two waves of reforms from 2011, 2013, and then 2014 to 2016. The major reform was the introductions of medium-term expenditure frameworks with multi-annual budgeting, sailing, and fiscal discipline, and also the introductions on comprehensive spending reviews. The reform entailed the strengthening of two important bodies. One is a parliamentary budget office, and the second one is the Irish government of Economic and Evaluation Service. This Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service is basically a team of macroeconomists that are there to analyze the different performance indicators and support best the governments in addressing the design of program and their performance. I think one of the key flagship reports of the Irish government is this Public Service Performance Report that I shared here the link in case you're interested in. Looking at Austria, Austria is a very methodological and gradual approach. So they basically planned their reform towards performance budgeting over a 12 years period. They had gradual approach with pilot projects, but also screening international benchmarks. They have also introduced legally binding medium-term expenditure framework, which was actually one of the biggest reform coming out of this gradual approach. Simplification of the budget. They have reduced the number of budget chapters, the number of objectives and indicators as well. And they have also created a robust organization toward performance budgeting with a new budget office created at the federal level and 3 bodies at the parliamentary level. One thing that is also sticking out from the example of Austria, and I think it's something very probably not unique, but something we should encourage, is periodical external evaluation of the government action. I think it also nurtures, the relevance on the way the reform is moving forward. And they have been providing also substantive trainings, not only to civil servants, but also to politicians, which I think it's also something very important. The Court of Auditor, again, has an important role to play here in the Austrian context, because the summary of their audit findings is attached to the budget bill when it's presented to the governments. Both Ireland and Austria, like France, also established an IT centralized system where performance indicators are being registered and compiled. Something that is, I think, both countries has achieved is with the introduction of the NCF, they still manage to align pretty well their strategic frameworks with the NCF over time. So just in a nutshell, that's this one. For the experience of EU member states, we have basically different approach of performance budgeting at different part of the cycle. So that's what I just mentioned. If you look at the vision and strategy, inclusive participation, for instance, is a good example from Austria or Sweden. Budgets are made also available and publicly before being adopted. That's the experience of Austria or Finland. If you look at governance, the introduction of parliamentary budget office in the case of Ireland that I just mentioned, or Austria, policies and program, we see, the consistency between strategic goals and at operational level, also consistency. There's the example of France. Data and information, having a centralized information system. We have Austria, France, Ireland, even Estonia here is mentioned. Being more visual was also a key priority for the French governments. People and communication trainings were provided. So Austria, Estonia did it too. NTF, when you look more into the organization and processes, it was a big reform for Ireland and Austria. And last but not least, if you look at the regularity framework with the reductions of the number of chapters, that's actually the case of Austria. Now, moving from EU member states to the EU level, the performance budgeting at the Commission has started actually also early 2000s. The experience of the European Union is actually building on the one of our EU member states. We have actually early with the Prodi Commission, so it was the former president of the European Commission at that time, where we really started to have activity defined with objectives and indicators placed also as full part of our reporting mechanism. But the real shift, I would say, to performance budgeting was under the presidency of Jean-Claude Juncker, who was the president of the European Commission under the previous EU budget. So when you will see on the slide MFF, it stands for Multi-Financial Framework, but for ease reference, I'm just going to mention EU budget. And there basically is where in 2015 we have the introductions of the budget focus on result initiative, but also other initiatives that requires a government of a whole approach when it's about better regulation and the way you design public policies. This before was also the major focus of the OECD review when looking at how the EU is doing in terms of budgeting. So when we look at before, what do we look at? We have four main questions basically. The first one is, in which area do we spend? The second is, how do we spend it? And the third main one, I would say, is how do we assess the budget implementation and its performance? Of course, the fourth pillar is always communication. How do you communicate it to the parliament, to citizens, and it's a lot about transparency and accountability. This before initiative has been really mainstreamed through the main process of the EU budget cycle, from the annual budget, also for the discharge procedures from the co-legislator, but also for the midterm review. So the EU budget is for 7 years. It's a multi-annual budget, and half of it basically we process a midterm review focusing on key performance indicators. Current MFF, so it's a current EU budget, which is of course this budget focus on results is very much relevant to the work we do now with the new budget. So I think one thing that is very important is the strategic goal of the EU. We have here our current president. Her mandate is actually coming to an end this year. You may be aware that the European Parliament will have its direct elections in June. Usually the president of the European Commission is elected based on the majority of votes gathered for one dedicated party during the election of the European Parliament. President von der Leyen is running for a second mandate, but here she basically provided for the current EU budget from 21-27 6 key political priorities. One of them that may be the most popular in Asia and Pacific is the Green Deal priority. But I think what is very interesting in her political statements is she's defining these 6 political priorities for the next 5 years and well beyond. So it's kind of still hint that there won't be a massive change of those political guidelines despite the potential change of presidency for the second half of the EU budget. So the EU budget is basically divided into 7 budget headings that you can see here with an approximate share of for each budget headings. One thing that the Commission has been doing also is this new EU budget was a real opportunity for us to use all performance information available. So we also use the good practices of other member states to publish well in advance the negotiation of the next EU budget in 2018 to start already having all relevant stakeholders involved in the process. We have used spending reviews, but also the midterm review that I was just mentioning earlier. When we are half of the implementation of our EU budget, we do a midterm review, and also, of course, other available performance information. For us at EU level, the performance-based practices is applicable from a mid-annual to an annual perspective. The budget is designed so we have sailing, of course, not to on an annual basis, not to be overpassed. There are limits clearly defined in the EU budget, and we have also for the multi-annual, of course, an amount of money dedicated per areas that cannot be overpassed. One important communication that the European Commission has published is our communication on performance framework from June 21. This communication is basically presenting how performance budgeting is being taken into account for designing and implementing the current EU budget. It has what we call the building blocks. The building blocks is basically explaining the rationale for the way each program was designed. But also on the other side to have a robust system to be able to monitor performance over time and to take adequate measures whenever needed. Clear objectives, there are two. One is to make sure that the challenge that is identified, the objective that is designed is responding to the challenge identified, sorry. And the second point, of course, is very important in the EU context, is to make sure that the EU is best to address it. Why? Because at the European Union, we have the principle of subsidiarity, which basically invites a member state who is better placed to address a solution to do it at the level of the country and not at the EU. I think two important things here are attached to this communication on performance framework. The one is the program and performance to the communication, which basically it's a publicly available document that presents you for each programs under the current EU budget all the list of performance indicators, their baseline, the milestones and targets to be reached by the end of the EU budget. And this information is basically updated on a yearly basis through what we call the program performance statement. I provided a link here, so if you're just curious to see where basically how we have designed the entire programs and how do we monitor performance and what it entails, I invite you to have a look at that. So for you to know, the EU has three main documents reports focusing on performance. It goes from the most aggregate level to the most detailed level. So the flagship of the European Commission reporting on performance is the annual management and performance report. This report is really concise and provide really key information and performance information on the way EU money is being spent. The other program, which is a bit more detailed, is the program performance overview. That is basically a fiche per program that provide you a bit more details what each program is for and how do we spend. These two reports are attached for the discharge procedures. So when we say discharge is when we send, the Commission send to the co-legislator our budget executions to basically approve also the next cycle. So these are very important documents for also the accountability of how we spend EU budget. The third one is, of course, a much more detailed one. It's the program statement, which actually this one is a basis for building the two other more concise reports. So the program statement also attached to the preparation of the annual budget, where basically you have a very detailed information, and that's where you see also the progress compared to the initial baseline. So here I'm not gonna go into much detail, but I just wanted to provide you first a report of the annual management and performance of the European Union and the Commission. We have so this is volume 1, which is really the bigger picture. I put also here the performance for 2022, where you see that our reporting is also fully aligned with the EU budget headings, where there you have 7 in total. Here it's so so volume 1 is really the concise picture. There is the performance overview, which is volume 2, and here I just provide you basically an example on where do we stand against our target, and there is a very strong link between the political priority and guidelines provided by our president that I just mentioned earlier, where here, for instance, she was putting a strong focus on the Green Deal, and how does our performance indicators and targets for the year 22 are matching the goal set for the entire period for the EU budget until 27. So we see in 22, for instance, our target was for the EU budget to target 30% on climate and streaming objectives. And now basically in 22, we were already overpassing this target by 3%. The program statement clearly is where you have so the most valuable and detailed information. You have, it's always a working document attached to the preparation of the budget. It really tells you why and on why do we and on what do we spend. It also provides clarification on where do we spend the money in the different budget headings. And also it gives you a snapshot on the implementation state of play compared to the baseline, achievement of milestone, and also forecast. Here, the cutoff date for the one that I just put as an example for the draft budget 24, the cutoff date was 22 fiscal year, ending on 31st December. Just interesting, just to note that some investments can also come from the previous EU budget for the period 2014-2020. Why? Is because some infrastructure project, for instance, leads and takes time before leading into some results. So every money that has been basically paid, even though it's a different budget cycle, are still reported for the fiscal year in which expenditure occurred. What are the lessons learned about performance-based practices? I think one of the first and most important is data quality, and the EU will pay a very strong focus on that. I think it's already to have a good overview of what information is available and in a timely fashion, and to what extent this is cost efficient. These are really key factors. The logic, of course, between linking your input, output, and outcomes is important to take into account. That's also part of the design of the indicator student. The link, of course, of your strategic goals and your budgetary process, that's definitely always a challenge. But I think we have seen in the EU member states and also at EU level some great efforts and achievement in that regard. Avoid the information overload. So without few indicators, I think we've seen a reductions in the few examples from the EU member state that have provided a reduction of indicators and objectives per program. That's really the trend. At the EU level, if you compare also the current EU budget compared to the previous one, we went from 1,100 indicators to 750. So we are also doing that simplification to focus on the most important one. I think organizational, managerial accountability for results. This is something also very important. This is my personal view, but I think we still in our administration focus a lot on compliance and absorption capacity instead of really shifting towards performance. There is, of course, now we're required in our reporting to really focus on results, but at the end of the day, some KPIs are really a lot about, controls, to what extent your money is being spent according to the rule, which is very important, but I think that's something that could be a subject for Q&A session discussion. Performance targets also, that's the way you design indicators. Sometimes in the EU, the Court of Auditor also has been vocal in the way we can audit, they can basically track, the way progress over time because of, the poor definition maybe of some target indicators. And of course, the last point of lesson learned is I think we have seen a very positive feedback from citizens and also stakeholders on enhancing transparency with the early publication of draft budget documents, and also how we communicate with our citizens on how taxpayer money is being spent. So to conclude, I think there is a strong political commitments and momentum for progressing on performance-based budgeting in general at the EU level, but also within our member states, especially now in the context of fiscal constraint at the EU level. Of course, you all know Brexit happened, so that also an impact on the way the EU budget has been financed. We have also different crises that has also forced us to really put a stronger emphasis on performance in view of growing needs and budgetary disciplines. Last but not least, I think it's also, no matter where you stand right now in your performance-based approach, I think the most important is to keep being realistic and not move too fast. I think there are a lot of international benchmarks that are useful to look and experience around the world, and I hope this kind of platform is actually useful for all of you for learning from other countries, but be assured that we all learn. I learn myself a lot here too. Thank you very much.